Welcome back to part 3 of our series where we are building the TD API client for Python, so the Python library that we will be using in order to basically go and use the TD Ameritrade API. So in our last video, we were kind of starting to get more into the coding aspects. So we talked about things like defining certain dunder methods that we would have related to our particular client object. So that was things like the initialization dunder method. So basically with that one, it was running through certain steps, defining certain attributes every time a new instance of our client was created. And then on top of that, we talked about the string representation. So this was creating a more quote unquote user-friendly readable version of our client object that we could then print if someone's chose to do so. And then we also talked about the headers function. So this was going to basically help us create a headers dictionary that we would use in future requests. So in this video, we're going to talk about the API endpoint, the state manager, and then I think that's probably it because the state manager is probably going to be a little bit long. We might start login. I'll kind of judge time as we get there. So the first one, the API endpoint. So we're going to define a new method. We're going to call it API endpoint. And so this particular method will take, again, the object itself, and then we're going to also pass through a URL. And so the purpose of this method is it's going to take a relative endpoint, so something like quotes, and it's going to basically create a complete URL that basically a complete URL necessary to make a request. And so if that's the case, then it will create that URL and it will send it back to the client object in future requests. And so it's pretty straightforward. There's really nothing super complicated about it. All we're going to do is we're going to return, and then we're going to call the URL lib library. And then inside of it, we're going to have a parse, and then we're going to do URL parse. There we go. Not unparse, it's parse. So URL parse, and then we're going to pass through the URL that was sent through the method, basically, or through the function. And then from here, oh wait, sorry, not URL parse. I'm looking at the wrong line. URL join. So we're going to take URL join, and then we're going to basically join the different components of our particular URL and then make it a single URL. And so the first one that we're going to need is self.config. And then inside that, we're going to do our resource URL component, and then we're going to do plus self.config, and then we're going to also do the API version, and then finally we're going to do, well, no, sorry, two more quotes / I think. I always get those two confused. And then it's going to be comma URL dot left strip, and then it's going to be quotes and then / So this is just going to remove the last hanging one, and there is one. So again, this is just creating a valid URL that we can then use in our request. And just as a reminder, in case you forgot, the resource URL is basically, where is it? Is basically taking the it's basically taking the default API URL. So this one right here, that's in our config file. And then we also have our version, and then it would also be whatever URL we pass through. So again, pretty hopefully simple things at this point, nothing too crazy. And then obviously you would be pretty good to go. And then I think that's pretty much it. And then again, just to kind of clarify, so this URL right here, this is the one that's being passed through. So in case you were wondering. So that's going to create our valid URL. Now comes a big topic. And so this is something called the state manager. It's definitely what I would say is one of the more important components of your client library. So before I start coding it, I kind of want to talk about it a little bit. So we're going to create a method. It's going to be called state manager. And so what this state manager is designed to do is it's basically going to do one of two things. It's going to either save the current state. So when I'm talking about current state, it basically any state or point in time when we're running our script, or we're going to initialize a new state. Now, there's a couple key things about this. What is the state? Well, the state is basically our client object at any given point in time during our script. And so what the state manager does is it basically takes all the information that describes our client object, or at least the pieces of information that we might need if we were to rerun our client object at a later point in time. And it's going to save the important components of our client object so that way we can then leverage them in future requests and avoid things like having to quote unquote log in multiple times and then pass through our credentials. And so that's really what the state manager is doing, is it's taking the attributes that describe our client object. So things like our API, our access token, things like whether we want to, like our refresh URL and things like that. So it's taking some of the important components of our TD client object and it's going to save it to a JSON file. And then depending on how the user basically calls the client, what they can do is they can leverage the saved state that was previously used. And so this will help us bypass the step of logging in and providing our credentials every time we were running our script. So that's really the whole purpose behind it. So what we're going to first do is we're going to create a new method called state manager. And so again, it's going to be something that's accessible by the object, and then we're going to have an action. The action can be one of two strings: init for initialize state, and then save for save the current state. And so when we're talking about the initialize state, basically it's going to have things like the access token is going to be set to none, refresh token is set to none, token expires at, and a couple other different pieces of information. It's going to basically initialize those values to their default value. And so again, just kind of save time a little bit. Where did I put it? Here it is. Perfect. I am going to kind of copy some code. We'll take that one. We will take that one. All right. And so this is our initialized state. So our initialized state will have an access token, which is none, refresh token, which is none, token expires at, authorization URL. Technically, this can be none as well. I don't know why I had a blank string. A redirect code, a token scope, and then logged in. So again, this is the initialized state. And then as we call certain functions inside our client object, our state will change. So all of a sudden, we'll have an access token, ideally. We'll have a refresh token. And then as our state is changing, we can use the state manager to save that state. And so how do we save that particular state? Well, we're going to basically just leverage a JSON file. So we're going to open up or create a JSON file to save or load our state. So the first thing we need to do, though, is we need to define the action. So there's going to be one of two actions: init or save. So if the state is initialized, and so we'll say if action double equals init, what do we want to do? Well, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to just have the state itself be initialized. So we're going to say self.state is going to equal the initialized state. So all we're doing is we're saying, okay, if they're initializing it, then all we're going to do is we're going to set the state of our client object to the default initialized state. So we're going to just set it to whatever's in this particular dictionary. That's what we're first going to do. Now, if the user had previously allowed for something called caching, that means we would want to update the values that were existing in that cached file, so the JSON file. So there's an easy way to first do that. So if self.config, we're going to do cache state. So if cache state, and we're going to do os path is file, and then we're going to pass through the file name. And then I realized, of course, I forgot it because I was rushing, as always. That's our file name. And so again, you could technically name it anything you want. You don't have to call it TD Ameritrade state.json. You can name it something else. But basically, we're going to first check, did they allow for the cached state? And does the file that we want to load, does it exist? So if those two conditions are met, then what you're going to do is you're going to open the file, and then you're going to update this little dictionary right here, because that's right now our initialized state. We want to now update that state to reflect what we have previously cached. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do with open file name, and then jumped up a little bit, with file name, and then read. So we're going to read the file as file handle. So this is just kind of like a little alias that we can use to easily reference it. So as the file handle, we can say self.state, and because it's a dictionary, we have the update method. Say update the keys so that way they match what is in the file handle. And again, because it's a JSON file, I'm going to say json.load file handle. If they allowed for caching and the file exists, load the file. That's really what you're doing in essence at this step. So that's that one. If they did not allow for caching, then we're going to do something else. So we're going to say, okay, say the user came out and said, hey, you know what? I don't want to actually cache my results. I believe there's sensitive information in there, and I just don't feel comfortable caching it to my local system. That's fine. Then what do you want to do? Well, we'll say, if they don't allow for caching, and sorry, it should be not in front. So if they don't want caching and the file still exists, then what we're going to do is just delete the file. And so that's pretty straightforward. We're going to just, again, call os remove and then just the file name. So basically all you're saying is, hey, if you don't allow for caching, we're going to play it safe, delete the file. If you don't want caching, or if they didn't allow for caching, delete the file. Now what this would require then is next time they log in, they're going to have to automatically provide their credentials. So the trade-off is, great, we don't have to store your information, but that means every time you log in, you will have to provide your credentials until you allow for caching. So until you allow for caching, every time you will have to provide your credentials. So that is defining the initialized action. So if somebody is initializing a new session, there's one of two options. If they've allowed for caching, load the previous values. If they didn't allow for caching, delete the file. And so if they want to save, so if they want to save this particular state, so we'll say elif action equals save, and they still allow for caching, and we'll say and self.config.cache state. So if they're saving it and they've allowed for caching, in this particular example, we're going to do pretty much the same. We're just going to take this and we're just going to modify it a little bit. And so we're going to say, okay, do a shift tab. In this case, we're going to write to the file because we're dumping the information. And then on top of that, what we're going to do is we're going to say JSON, so JSON dump, and then we're going to do JSON string file handle, and that's it. So we're going to basically take our state, whatever it is at that given point in time, and we're just going to dump it to the file, and we're going to save that file. So that way we have saved our state at a given point in time. Now we'll see where this is called throughout our particular client, but we'll see it used in the login session and all sorts of things like that. But really, again, just to kind of emphasize, the state manager is just helping us either initialize a new state, load a previously saved state, or save the current state. That's really all it's doing at the end of the day. It looks a little complicated, but in essence, that's what it's doing. So if they want to save it and have allowed for caching, then load the file. And I guess technically something you would probably want to do is, again, also making sure the file name exists. But for the most part, it really doesn't matter in this example. Well, actually, yeah, no, it wouldn't matter because you're just writing to it. So even if it didn't exist, it would just write the new file. So that's in essence what the state manager is doing. So now that we've covered the state manager, let's move on to the next component, which is the login method. So the login method is kind of another important part of this whole particular client object. This is going to actually log us in, or it's going to take us through the steps to log us in. So there's a couple different components of it. There's kind of one of two options. The first one is if they've allowed for caching, the first thing we want to try is to do a silent authentication. So basically all that means is we would go to this JSON file, we would load the previously saved files, and once we've done that, we would just get a refresh token. That's really in essence what we're doing. But that is conditioned on the fact that they've allowed for caching. So we're not even going to attempt that if they've never allowed for caching. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be guaranteed successful. So for example, we can try to do a silent authentication, but say, for example, just the access token was expired. Well, guess what? In that particular situation, I have to put you through the process of logging in and providing your credentials. However, that should be relatively infrequently because your access token should be valid for at least 60 days. So that's really kind of the important component behind this is it's going to eliminate the necessity of having to provide your login credentials every time you restart your script. So that's kind of the important component. So if caching was enabled, then attempt a silent authentication. And so basically the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say if self.config and then cache state. So again, if it's true, and make sure it's lowercase. So if it's true, great. Attempt a silent authentication. And this will again make a little bit more sense when we get to it. But basically it's going to return something. And if it did return something, guess what? You are good to go. Your login function just needs to return true and you're good. So you are then logged in. So you were logged in. The silent authentication was successful. Now that is for the what is it? That is for the silent authentication component. So if that wasn't the case, then we have to go through the full authentication process of providing our credentials. And so the first thing we'll do is we'll update the authentication state. And so this is again just that attribute that we defined earlier. And you can give it something like, I don't know, authenticated. You can also, like I said, use random number generators. That's what the Microsoft Graph did in our particular state. I don't think it really matters, but maybe I'm wrong. So now we have to basically build the components to make a request. And so we've seen this before in previous videos. The first one is we have to prepare a payload, encode that payload. We're going to then build the URL for the authentication endpoint. And then we're going to provide it to the user. And then the user is going to go to that particular URL and it will then, It will then log in. They'll copy the URL, they'll pass it back to Python, and then we'll continue the authentication workflow. So first, what I'm going to do is, again, to save some time, I'm going to just copy some code and not worry about if it was typed correctly or not. So this is our payload for our authentication endpoint. We need a response type. In this case, we want the code. We need to have a redirect URI. So that is the one that you defined when you created a new application. And then we're going to also need our client ID, which is really just our consumer ID plus our little, TD Ameritrade like OAuth AP. So that's the payload. The next part is then going to be encoding it. So URL encode the data. And we've done this before, so we'll just give it something like params. We'll say URL lib. And then we'll say parse URL encode, and then we'll pass through that data. Okay, so we've got that part down. We'll build the full URL. So what we're going to do is we'll create a new variable called URL. We'll call our self.configuration dictionary. Wow, I'm losing my voice already. We'll do endpoint, so authentication endpoint, plus the parameters that we have done so far. And then from here, what we are going to do is then say self, we're going to say self.state authorization URL, and that's going to equal our URL. Perfect. So that's good so far. And then from here, what we need to do is we need to ask the user to go to a particular URL. So what we're going to do is say ask the user to go to a URL, and then we're going to say print, please go. I'm just going to copy it. Just save the trouble. Yeah, I'll just grab the rest of this and kind of walk through it a little bit. Perfect. Okay, so the first thing is we're going to ask the user to go to the URL and then authorize your account. And then we're going to say, okay, take my response. So the response is basically they're going to copy the URL once they've been redirected. And then what they're going to do after that is they're going to go through basically the next step of the authentication workflow. Now that's done by the client object, but we're going to need things like the redirect code, and then we're going to call another function, or sorry, another method called the grab access token method. So that's basically phase 2 of our particular authentication workflow. Now we will cover that one in the next video, but at this point, if you have any questions about the login method or the state manager method, feel free to put them down below, and we'll try to help guide you through that process. Otherwise, in the next video, we are going to define the logout method, the grab access token method. We'll see silent SSO, so the silent authentication, we'll do that. Token refresh. I mean, we'll see. I mean, I think we'll probably be able to get through most of it because those ones are relatively short and they're kind of not too complicated. But it's really important you kind of understand these two because that's really the crux of making your workflow automated. So that is what you can expect in the next video. So thank you again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.